On a freezing Chicago night, a little girl clutched her worn teddy bear and whispered words that would shatter even the coldest heart. "Everyone has a home except me." In that moment, a powerful CEO, someone who had everything money could buy but nothing that truly mattered, stopped in his tracks. What happened next would not only change her life, but his forever. This isn't just a story about wealth or charity. It's about what happens when two broken worlds collide and discover something far stronger than loneliness: family. If you've ever wondered whether one small choice can rewrite an entire life, stay with us. This story will remind you that hope can be found in the most unexpected places. And before we begin, make sure to subscribe to Hidden Echo Stories, because the next story might be the one that stays in your heart forever. The city of Chicago lay wrapped in a veil of snow, the kind of winter night that made every street sound muted, as though the world had drawn a curtain over its own noise. Traffic lights blinked red and amber through the flurries, and the rhythm of hurried footsteps left shallow prints that filled almost as soon as they were made. In a black Range Rover idling on the curb, Henry Whitmore sat behind the wheel, his gaze fixed outward but seeing very little. The glow of his dashboard reflected faintly on his face, which carried the polished confidence of a man used to being in control, though the hollowness in his eyes betrayed him. Moments earlier, he had ended another empty call with a board member, a conversation about numbers, projections, and layoffs. It was the language of his world, spoken daily, yet every time it left him feeling less like a man and more like a machine. His phone buzzed again, a message from his assistant reminding him of a gala, the kind of event where people pretended to care more about causes than contracts. He silenced it and leaned back, the silence of the car both a comfort and a weight. At 40 years old, he was the head of one of the largest real estate firms in the city. His name was engraved on plaques in universities and hospitals. His signature adorned million-dollar deals, and his wealth had reached a level where numbers no longer felt real. Yet the one word that defined him, though he rarely admitted it even to himself, was empty. The snow outside drifted across the windshield in soft spirals, and his eyes wandered toward a pool of light cast by a street lamp. There, at the edge of the sidewalk, sat a figure so small he almost thought it was a trick of the storm. But no, she was real. A little girl, no more than 6, curled against the cold, her arms wrapped tightly around a weathered teddy bear as if it were the only warmth she had left. Her coat was too thin, yellow at one time but frayed now at every seam, her boots untied, her cheeks flushed raw by the wind. She was speaking, but not to anyone who could answer her, only to the bear in her arms or maybe to herself. Henry lowered his window just enough for the cold to sting his face. The air that rushed in was sharp and biting, yet it seemed necessary, like a slap of reality. "Hey," he called softly. "Are you all right?" The girl lifted her head, eyes wide but not startled, as if she was used to strangers passing by without stopping. There was no fear in her gaze, only a kind of tired steadiness that felt far too old for her small frame. Then she whispered, so quietly that he almost missed it beneath the hush of falling snow, "Everyone has a home except me." The word struck like a blow. Henry's grip on the steering wheel tightened until the leather pressed into his palms. He thought of the 3 homes he owned, the endless rooms filled with furniture he rarely used, the empty penthouse where silence echoed louder than laughter. In that moment, all of it felt like a cruel illusion. He had built towers of glass and steel, yet here sat a child on the frozen ground who spoke the truth he had avoided all along. He had everything but belonging. Before he could respond, the little girl stood brushing snow from her teddy's ears and began to walk. Her steps were small, steady, purposeful, carrying her toward the alley behind a bakery. Henry hesitated. His instinct told him to stay put, to keep the separation between his life and hers. He was not someone who dealt with stray children or sidewalk confessions. He was a man of order, contracts, carefully measured boundaries. Yet even as the thought circled, his hand reached for the door handle. The cold wind lashed him as he stepped out, his polished shoes sinking into slush. He followed her, his heart packing faster with every step, She moved without looking back, as though she knew he would follow but did not need to confirm it. "What is your name?" he asked finally, his voice cracking more than he intended. "Nora," she replied without turning. "You should not be out here alone, Nora." She shook her head softly. "I am not. I am going home." She pointed to a narrow metal door beneath a staircase, hidden between rusted fences and overflowing garbage bins. It looked nothing like a home, but she approached it with the certainty of someone who had no other place to go. "My aunt lives here," she explained. "Kind of, I do too." Henry stared at the door, then back at her fragile figure. "Does she know you are out here?" Nora shrugged. "She works late. I do not think she saw me leave." She hesitated, then turned her dark eyes on him with a question that seemed far too heavy for a child. "Are you someone who keeps walking, or someone who helps?" He did not know how to answer. For most of his life, he had been the man who kept walking, not out of cruelty, but because it was easier to remain detached, to measure life in profits and schedules rather than messy human needs. But this child with 6 words had pierced through his armor. Something deep inside him, something he thought had withered long ago, stirred awake. "I guess we are about to find out," he murmured. Nora nodded slightly, as if the answer would do for now, then pushed the door open. Warm, stale air drifted out, carrying with it the smell of age and survival. Henry hesitated, standing at the threshold of a world far from his own, then stepped inside. The hallway was dim, lined with peeling paint and tiles that stuck faintly to his shoes. Nora moved with familiarity, her small figure illuminated by the weak glow of a single bulb overhead. At the end of the corridor, she knocked gently on a dented beige door. When it opened, Henry saw a young woman with tired eyes and paint smudges on her wrist. Her expression shifted quickly from confusion to protectiveness as she noticed the stranger standing behind Nora. This was Claire, her aunt, who had raised her since her mother died and her father disappeared. The apartment was cramped, the furniture worn, but there was a heartbeat of warmth in the chaos, a trace of resilience stitched into every corner. As Henry stepped cautiously inside, he realized this was the first real home he had entered in years, not because of what it contained, but because of who lived there. And though he could not explain why, he knew that the moment Nora whispered those words to him on the snowy street, his life had begun to turn in a direction he could never have imagined. The apartment was far from what Henry was accustomed to, yet something about it pulled him in. A single light bulb swayed slightly from the ceiling, casting shadows across the worn couch and the scattering of crayons and paper on the table. The space smelled faintly of coffee grounds, paint, and the quiet struggle of a life held together with more love than money. Claire introduced herself, guarded but polite, her tone carrying both fatigue and defiance. She looked younger than Henry expected, barely 30, her hair pulled into a messy knot, her sweatshirt stained with streaks of color from some half-finished canvas. Her eyes lingered on Henry with suspicion, as though trying to decide whether he was danger, salvation, or simply another passerby. Nora dropped her teddy on the couch and moved toward the small kitchen as if nothing unusual had happened, while Claire folded her arms across her chest. Henry raised his hands gently, explaining that he had found Nora outside in the cold. Claire's protective stance softened slightly but did not disappear. She had raised the child alone for years, working long shifts at a diner and taking side jobs painting murals whenever she could. Her life was stretched thin, yet every sacrifice was etched into the walls of this cramped apartment. On the peeling refrigerator door hung drawings of stars, houses, and little stick figures that told the story of a child who dreamed bigger than her reality. Henry sat for a while, awkward in his tailored suit that seemed too sharp for such a fragile space. Nora returned from the kitchen with a small tin of cookies, holding one out to him with the kind of innocent generosity that disarmed even the hardest of men. He knelt, taking the offering with both hands, and whispered thank you. It was not the cookie that mattered. It was the act of being included, of being seen by someone who had so little yet gave so freely. For a man who had spent years in boardrooms where kindness was measured by contracts, that small gesture felt heavier than any deal he had signed. The night ended quietly, but Henry could not shake the image of Nora's thin coat and the words she had whispered beneath the snow. He left with a polite farewell, but his thoughts lingered. Back in his penthouse, surrounded by glass walls and silence, he could not focus on the reports stacked on his desk. He closed his laptop and leaned back, haunted by her steady gaze and the question she had asked him. Are you someone who keeps walking or someone who helps? The answer was no longer abstract. It demanded action. The next morning he returned. This time he carried a grocery bag and a small heater. Claire opened the door with hesitation, clearly surprised to see him again. I brought breakfast, Henry said simply, holding up the bag, and this might help. He placed the heater on the floor, its hum filling the apartment with immediate warmth. Nora came running barefoot, her face lighting up when she saw him. You came back, she said, her voice rising with joy. Henry smiled and nodded. I told you I would. They sat together at the small kitchen table. Claire poured instant coffee into chipped mugs while Nora devoured a muffin with a hunger that revealed how rare such treats were. Henry watched, not with pity, but with a strange sense of belonging he could not explain. He listened as Nora chattered about her drawings, about the stars she imagined hanging above her bed, about the world she created in crayon colors. When she scampered away to show him her sketchbook, Henry flipped through pages filled with homes she had never known, houses glowing with light, families standing hand in hand beneath skies full of stars. And there, among the simple drawings, appeared his figure again and again, tall and suited, sometimes faceless, sometimes smiling. She had drawn him into her imagined home long before he had decided to stay. Claire noticed his expression as he stared at the pages. She draws places she wishes she could live, she explained softly. Sometimes I think it is her way of building a home for herself, one drawing at a time. Henry closed the book gently and asked if he might hold on to it for a while. Claire looked puzzled. Why? Because, Henry answered quietly, if I want to help her, I need to understand what home means to her. Claire said nothing, but her eyes softened with a recognition she had not expected to feel toward this man. The days that followed revealed more of the quiet bond forming between them. Henry arrived often, sometimes with food, sometimes with small things the apartment lacked. He never pushed his presence, never demanded gratitude. He simply showed up. Nora began waiting at the door, her smile widening each time. Claire, though cautious, allowed him into their routine, observing how her niece blossomed under his attention. She had known men who promised much but delivered little. Henry was different. His promises were unspoken, fulfilled by actions rather than words. Then came the moment that shifted everything. One evening, Henry arrived not with muffins or heaters but with keys. He offered them to Claire, explaining that it was for a new apartment his company owned, a safe building with working heat, a nearby school, and space enough for Nora to grow. Claire recoiled, suspicion sharp in her voice. We are not charity cases, she said. Henry shook his head calmly. This is not charity, it is a reset. No child should have to imagine what safety feels like. She should live it. For a long while, Claire said nothing. Nora peeked from behind the doorframe, teddy in hand, and asked if he had brought more muffins. Henry smiled softly, placing the envelope on the table without pushing further. You can say no, he said gently, but she deserves a place where her drawings come true. It took a day, perhaps two, before Claire called with a simple answer. We will try. By the end of the week, they moved into the new apartment. The change was visible from the moment Nora stepped inside. Her new bedroom was filled with light from a wide window, her books lined neatly on shelves, her bed warm with fresh blankets. Henry arrived soon after with a long box. Inside were glow-in-the-dark stars. He climbed on a chair and placed them across the ceiling in constellations. When Nora opened her eyes to see them, she gasped in delight. It is my sky, she whispered. Henry smiled, replying softly, Now you will always have stars above you, even when it rains. She leapt into his arms, and Claire, watching from the doorway, pressed her hand against her chest, silently holding back tears. It was then that Henry realized something irreversible had happened. He had not simply stepped into their lives for a moment of kindness. He had chosen to stay. And for the first time in years, he felt that he had found something money could never buy, a place where he belonged, a place where his presence mattered, a place that felt like home. Life in the new apartment settled into a rhythm that Henry never imagined he would be part of. Mornings carried the scent of coffee and toast, afternoons filled with laughter as Nora showed off her newest crayon worlds, and evenings ended with stories beneath her ceiling of glowing stars. For Claire, there was finally room to breathe. She began painting again, sunlight catching the strokes of her brush as if the walls themselves were grateful for her colors. For Henry, it was a transformation he had not sought but could no longer live without. The quiet chaos of their small household felt more alive than the sterile perfection of his penthouse. Nora grew more radiant by the day. Her cheeks flushed with warmth instead of cold, her drawings turned brighter, filled with galaxies and families standing hand in hand. Henry began walking her to school on certain mornings, his tailored suits drawing curious looks from other parents, though none of that mattered when she slipped her small hand into his. At night, when she asked if he would still be there when she woke, his answer was no longer hesitant. Yes, always. And every morning she found him there. Claire watched all of this with a cautious heart. She had raised Nora alone for years, carrying the weight of loss and hardship in silence, never expecting anyone to step in. Yet this man who once belonged to skyscrapers and boardrooms was now sitting cross-legged on the floor cutting paper stars, or waiting outside her art class with cocoa in hand. She wanted to resist, to protect herself from disappointment, but she could not deny what she saw. Nora was happier, and so was she. It was during this fragile balance that a shadow returned. One late evening, a knock rattled their door. Claire opened it only to find Jason standing there, dressed in a suit that did not quite fit, his smirk heavy with arrogance. He claimed he wanted his daughter back, waving legal papers and promises of stability. Nora shrank behind Henry, clutching his shirt with wide, fearful eyes. Claire's voice trembled with anger as she reminded Jason that he had abandoned them before Nora was even born. But Jason was undeterred, insisting that biology gave him rights. His final words carried a threat. He would return with a court order. The days that followed were heavy. Nora, once so bright, began drawing darker pictures, houses missing windows, stick figures with jagged edges. She woke at night from dreams that left her trembling. Henry stayed by her side, holding her hand until sleep returned, whispering again and again that no one was going to take her away. Still, the fear lingered. Claire tried to stay strong, but the weight of uncertainty pressed hard against her. Henry, however, was no stranger to battles. He hired a lawyer, gathered evidence of Jason's criminal ties, and prepared for the fight ahead. He knew this was not about contracts or shareholders. It was about a child's safety, about a promise he had silently made the first night she whispered those 6 words in the snow. The courtroom was a place Henry knew well from business disputes, yet it had never felt as suffocating as it did that day. Nora sat between him and Claire, dressed in a blue dress dotted with tiny stars, her teddy bear clutched tightly in her arms. Jason arrived with his lawyer, feigning respectability, but the cracks showed easily. Claire's attorney presented records of Jason's absence, his criminal history, and even a photograph taken secretly of Nora at the park, proof of stalking. Then it was Henry's turn to speak. He did not use notes, nor did he rely on legal jargon. He spoke from the only place that mattered, his heart. Family, he said, was not built by blood but by presence. He told the court about bedtime stories, about school pickups, about the simple promise of staying. Jason, he reminded them, had every chance to be a father but chose not to. Now he wanted credit for biology, but biology had never comforted a frightened child in the middle of the night. When the judge asked if the child wished to speak, Nora rose. Her small frame trembled, but her voice was clear. She looked at Jason and said, "I do not remember him. He never came for me." Then she turned to Henry, her voice cracking with emotion. "But he did. He stayed. He brings me cocoa and stars for my ceiling. He makes me feel safe, like I belong." The silence that followed was heavier than any verdict. Even Jason could not meet her eyes. The judge reviewed the evidence, and when a file confirming Jason's involvement in narcotics reached the bench, the decision became undeniable. Custody would remain with Claire. Henry would be recognized as a legal guardian and trusted protector. Jason's visitation rights were suspended indefinitely. The gavel struck, and the weight lifted. Nora ran into Henry's arms, sobbing not from fear but from relief. Claire's shoulders shook with quiet gratitude as she whispered, "I do not know what we would have done without you." Henry held Nora close, replying softly, "You will never have to again." The weeks after the trial felt like the first breath after a long storm. Nora slept peacefully, no longer checking the hallway twice. Claire painted more freely, laughter returning to her voice. Henry felt at home in a way that glass towers had never given him. They moved again, not out of necessity but choice. The new apartment overlooked a botanical garden, its walls filled with light, its rooms carrying the promise of permanence. Nora's bedroom became her dream. Lavender walls, shelves for her books, a nook by the window, and above her bed fiber optic stars that shimmered like a real night sky. When she saw them, she whispered, "Is it real?" Henry answered, "It is yours." She twirled beneath the glowing ceiling, her joy spilling into every corner. Claire stood beside him, whispering that Nora would remember this forever. Henry looked at her and said, "So will I." Life became simple, ordinary, and extraordinary all at once. Grocery runs, Sunday pancakes, mismatched socks, and laughter around the table replaced board meetings and endless phone calls. Henry learned to braid Nora's hair, to burn toast on lazy mornings, to cheer at Claire's art shows as though they were world premieres. One evening, when Nora brought home a form for Parents and Guardians Day, she asked if he could come. His calendar was full, stacked with meetings that would have once consumed him. But he looked at the date and told her without hesitation, "I will be there." And when the day came, she introduced him proudly as her kind of dad. It was in those small moments, woven into the fabric of everyday life, that Henry realized the truth. He had not only given Nora a home, she had given him one too, a place where love was not measured by wealth but by presence, a place where he was no longer empty because he had found where he belonged. There are stories that entertain us for a moment, and then there are stories that leave fingerprints on our hearts forever. Nora's whisper on that snowy night was more than a plea. It was a truth that echoed in every silent space Henry carried inside him. "Everyone has a home except me." 6 words that turned a stranger into family, wealth into meaning, and loneliness into love. Henry never planned to become a father figure. He never set out to exchange boardrooms for bedtime stories, or skyscrapers for kitchen tables filled with crayons and spilled juice. Yet when life gave him the chance to keep walking or to stay, he chose to stay. And in that choice, everything changed. Nora found not only warmth and safety, but also someone who would never leave. Claire found relief after years of carrying the weight of the world alone. And Henry found the one thing money could never buy: belonging. Family, as this story reminds us, is not just about where you begin. It is about who shows up, who stays through storms, who builds a future with you even when the past feels broken. Nora's drawings of homes and stars were not dreams anymore. They became real ceilings filled with light, kitchens filled with laughter, and mornings filled with love. They became a life where forever was not a hope but a promise. Perhaps you too have felt like Henry once did, successful on the outside, empty on the inside. Or maybe like Claire, exhausted from carrying more than one person should. Or like Nora, waiting for someone to prove that love does not always walk away. This story is for you. It is a reminder that even in the coldest winters, hope can arrive softly, disguised as a stranger who decides to stay. And now, as you let this story settle in your heart, we invite you to stay with us. Subscribe to Hidden Echo Stories, where each tale is chosen not just to entertain, but to remind you of what truly matters: love, second chances, and the families we choose. Because the next story might be the one that whispers to you the way Nora whispered to Henry. And sometimes, a whisper is all it takes to change everything.